9/11 was an event that will go down in history as the single worst terrorist attack of all time, an event that forever changed the way of life for millions of Americans and later the entire world. From initiating the ongoing war on terrorism to reworking air travel in its entirety, the effects of 9/11 on the world are extremely well documented, for the most part. For one group of Americans, the effects were covered up, swept under the metaphorical rug of the American government. Undocumented immigrants can be described as almost a second wave of first responders to the scene itself, taking considerable risks to aid the relief of 9/11. However, following the attacks, extreme measures were taken by the US government to stifle and prevent further terrorist attacks, and the undocumented families were caught in the crossfire.
Can you tell us about the scene down there right now?
Right now, people are just on the street looking at the building. There's just a lot of smoke.
But it wasn't as if the government couldn't do anything at the time. The public was terrified, their pride was damaged, and above all else, the image of American superiority was tainted for the first time.
All 19 of the hijackers were in the U.S. on legal visas, issued in their true names with no real background checks.
The exploitation of gaps in American security, coupled with foreign identity of all 19 hijackers, the events of 9/11 caused a natural human response of overreaction to danger in both the American public and government to create an image, through pattern recognition, of undocumented immigrants as a threat to America. This led to undocumented immigrants being unfairly scapegoated by an attack which, because of lax airport security and increasing global tensions at the time, was realistically always going to happen.
Responsible for security.
Even so, as the Government Accountability Office has since found, the equipment of the new agency, the TSA, still can't reliably detect explosives, and TSA screeners continue to somehow miss a huge number of guns and weapons at airport security posts.
The words that most likely caught your attention in the prior statement were 9/11 was always going to happen. But what do I mean by that? To quote Jeff Price, the Assistant Security Director at Denver National Airport at the time, "It was so easy. A lot of us were surprised it hadn't happened sooner." Before 9/11, security was almost invisible, and it really was designed to be that way. It was designed to be something in the background that wasn't really noticeable and definitely did not interfere with aircraft or airport operations. You could walk up to the gate at the very last minute. You did not need to have a boarding pass. All you had to do was go through the security checkpoint. No questions asked, no ID needed. However, even with these shockingly non-existent security protocols, hijackers still were placed under additional scrutiny under a system known as CAPS, or Computer Assisted Passenger Pre-Screening System. But according to the 9/11 Commission report, under security rules in place at the time, the only consequence of the hijacker selection by CAPS was that the checked bags were held off the plane until it was confirmed that he had boarded the aircraft. This did not hinder the hijackers' plans. The reason for this was the impressive stupidity of the restrictions on the carry-on equipment, or more accurately, lack thereof. Guns were of course banned, but knives up to 4 inches long and even razor blades were allowed to board. The hijackers knew this, and abused this lack of critical thinking by the US government and hijacked the planes with sharp weapons permitted to them on board. In addition to being physically weak, strategically we would not even consider the possibilities that the terrorists would hijack planes or even suicide bombs. As written in the NPR article that the prior information was siphoned from, aviation security experts acknowledge that prior to 9/11, no one envisioned suicide terrorists wanting to use commercial airplanes as weapons and being willing to kill themselves in order to kill hundreds of innocent people. Nowhere in the execution was the blame to fall on the shoulders of the undocumented immigrants. Realistically, anybody with basic flight training could have pulled off a surprisingly easy attack, regardless of the scale. It could have been a street block, a university campus, a company building, or even the White House. All of the conditions for 9/11 were there for anybody in the world to take it on. It just happened to be the undocumented Al-Qaeda members who committed such a horrible act of terrorism that was almost waiting to happen.
Ringleader Mohammed Atta and at least 4 of the other 19 hijackers made 6 visits to Las Vegas between late May and mid-August. Atta, who piloted the first plane into the World Trade Center, flew to Las Vegas on June 28th, rented a car, then spent 90 minutes online at an internet cafe across from UNLV.
However, because these were undocumented immigrants, pattern recognition led these people to be scapegoated by the American public, causing the government to employ strict new guidelines around them as an overreaction response to perceived danger that the undocumented immigrants soon became. For a little psychology lesson, in the words of one Mark Leary, the art of overreacting can be defined as a common behavior in human and even animal societies. We overreact to protect ourselves from threats and dangers. When applied to humans on an individual level, it is important that we overreact at times to prevent others from using and exploiting us for their own benefit. For instance, if you build a social image as a person who does not care about being treated unfairly, you introduce yourself as a target for exploitation and similar acts. So we overreact to nip the problem in the bud. However, when brought on a societal scale, there can be devastating consequences, especially when paired with pattern recognition.
She'll say it could be an indicator of what's to come after restrictions.
To briefly explain, pattern recognition is the part of the abilities of the brain that helps us recognize certain objects and situations and how to deal with them. Picture in your heads a door. We know what a door is because of previous encounters with them. Look around you and you'll probably be able to see one yourself. We also know that through same encounters, you can open and close doors. Even if we encounter a type of door we have never seen before, we can fairly assume that it is a door and how to use it. This type of pattern recognition, as useful as it is, can nevertheless be a little quick to judge and can enforce biases and stereotypes that may not necessarily always be true. This is not always a bad thing. For example, say you were walking alone at night in a high-crime city like Detroit, Chicago, or New York City, and all of a sudden, you notice a large man in a hoodie behind you, seemingly following you. The pattern recognition in your brain would most likely incentivize you to walk faster or to areas of more people. You would not be at fault for this. Not only have you heard of many people being mugged, killed, raped, and or kidnapped in similar situations, but the likelihood increases exponentially at night and in a high-crime neighborhood. This issue arises, however, when you escape the individual situation and start thinking about society as a whole. In this case, the American public's view of foreigners and immigrants.
Nearly 180,000 illegal immigrants with criminal records ordered deported from our country are tonight roaming free to threaten peaceful citizens.
When it comes to a large-scale terrorist attack like this, it is the job of the government to protect people from further harm, and to do this, they would take naturally extremely drastic measures, overreacting in response to danger. Furthermore, this attack would trigger pattern recognition in the eyes of the people. Suspicious-looking foreigners, especially those with darker skin, may be a threat to the safety of America. Because of this, undocumented immigrants have been subjected to a slew of discriminatory policies that undermine their efforts to aid relief in the wake of the tragedy. These immigrants were subcontracted to aid both in immediate emergency and cleanup of a disaster site. And many of them today suffer not only from physical and mental trauma, but also from a slew of respiratory diseases and cancers from smoke inhalation and radioactive chemicals found at the site. One particular story is extremely powerful and perfectly shows the experience of a first responder. Rafael Hernandez, a volunteer firefighter who was a direct responder to 9/11. He saved lives, put out fires, and cleaned up the scene. He died in 2010. The cause? A 9/11 related illness. Rosa Maria Bramble Caballero, a social worker who's helped undocumented immigrants affected by 9/11, tragically explained how
his son, who is now in Mexico, is in college. He can't even go to college. In fact, there is no funding. There is nothing available for the children of undocumented workers who died because they sacrificed their lives in this recovery effort.
Ordinarily, workers would be able to sue for safety and health hazards that were not disclosed nor properly identified. However, due to the scale of the cleanup and legal status of the workers, many have yet to receive any compensation, and even more are unable to do so. Caballero explains,
initially, a lot of that money, since they had to go to private attorneys took 33% of whatever little they were getting, and so they were pretty much left with really minimal income. And the group that was working as cleanup workers under the James Droga Act, some of them have received funds, some of them are still waiting.
It all started in the weeks following 9/11. Undocumented immigrants soon lost the ability to maintain their legal IDs, driver licenses, and several other legal rights that they had. They were pushed out of several job markets and housing areas simply because of xenophobia that was running rampant at the time. In the case of Carla Cornejo Villavicencio, the author of a book called The Undocumented Americans, she notes how this deeply affected her father. "My father is a man who has lived his life in the shadows, always one step ahead of deportation. I've only seen him cry twice. The second time was when he told me he was tired of living like a criminal. He was tired of being afraid all the time. He was tired of not being able to vote. He was tired of not being able to live a normal life. These undocumented Americans gave their lives and even risked them after 9/11 for very little, if anything at all, in return. To this day, the wave of first responders who are undocumented has received nothing, where their citizen counterparts have. The issue of undocumented people in general is much more important in the present than it was in 2001, and they have been subjected to much worse treatment in recent years, post 9/11, than back then as well. And if things keep going the way they are currently, they will soon be forgotten, overshadowed, buried, under the overwhelming consequences of the tragedy that was September 11th, 2001.